Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S exam prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. So let's begin the discussion by first taking a look at the topics we're going to cover from today's Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. We have 4 important articles which require a detailed analysis. They cover different subjects including polity, internal security and international relations. We shall take a detailed look at all these articles and have a comprehensive understanding of these important topics. After that, we shall take a look at 4 other important prelims articles, which are mainly relevant for our prelims. So these are the 8 topics we have lined up for discussion today. And before we start, do express your support for our initiatives by liking the video, share your comments, and also share the videos with other aspirants. And also don't forget, on the Telegram channel, we have a quiz after the session ends. There will be questions on these topics which will help you revise these topics again. So do subscribe to the Telegram channel. The link has been given in the description below. So let's get started with the first article from page number 1. In the headline page, there is an important article that makes a reference to the data protection bill that has been currently drafted by the government. The government of India has informed the Supreme Court in an ongoing case that a new data protection bill will be introduced in the upcoming monsoon session of the Parliament. There was an ongoing case at the Supreme Court involving cases of data misuse by social media firms like WhatsApp and Facebook. In this case, the Supreme Court had sought a representation from the government of India and had asked the government why India still does not have a data protection law. So in this context, the government has informed the Supreme Court that the Personal Data Protection Bill, the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill 2022 is ready. The draft version is ready. It has been brought out into the public domain just a couple of months ago. The government is inviting feedback from the public and all the stakeholders. And once the draft bill is finalized, it will be tabled this year, hopefully in the upcoming monsoon session. So in this context, it becomes very important to understand what is data protection. Why is data protection important? What's the legal framework in India and around the world with regard to data protection? So these are some key points we need to discuss. It's very important with regard to your mains exam. It's very relevant even for an essay topic, even for your prelims. So let's understand this topic thoroughly. See, today we live in the world of data. In a world driven by computing, internet and communication networks, data represents everything. It is said that data is the new oil or the new gold. Those who possess data, those who control data, they get to dominate the world. Because today's economy is going through the 4th stage of the Industrial Revolution. And the 4th stage of the Industrial Revolution is driven by data. If the first industrial revolution was driven by steam and subsequent stages were driven by relevant technologies, including computing, communication, networks, internet, etc. Now the 4th stage of the industrial revolution is being driven by data. This data is primarily generated by us, by the individuals. Right? We are the primary data generators. This data is being collected, harvested, stored, transferred and processed for various purposes by private entities who are the intermediaries and also by your government agencies. So it becomes very important to ensure that the security of this data and the privacy of this data, the privacy of those individuals who are generating this personal intimate data is guarded and secured. For this, you need a legal framework. You need a law in place. You need regulations in place, which are brought out by the government to protect the data privacy and data security of the citizens, of the individuals. This is also a question of national security as well. Because by ensuring data security and data privacy for the citizens, the government will fulfill a national security objective as well. Because if sensitive personal data were to fall in the wrong hands, it could be easily misused to create security challenges as well. So in this context, let's understand what is personal data, why data protection is so important. The best definition for data protection and personal data is provided by the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union. This particular law of the European Union is seen as a model, it's seen as a global standard when it comes to personal data protection. Even India looks at the GDPR of European Union to draw some lessons which could be relevant for the Indian context. The European Union has brought out one of the most advanced and balanced data protection regimes called GDPR, which was introduced in 2016. It strikes a fine balance between protecting the rights of individuals, protecting data privacy and security of the individuals, while enabling the legal control over data and holding the companies, the social media companies and the intermediaries accountable under the law. So according to the GDPR of European Union, personal data is defined as any data, any information which is directly related or linked to a person who is generating the data. By looking at certain data sets, if you can identify who is the individual behind it, if you can get to know the person behind it, if it reveals their identity, then such data is personal data. This includes basic biographic details, the name of the person, sex, date of birth, their place, their location, physical attributes including biometric details of that person, fingerprints, retinal scans, etc., health information of the person, contact details, the address of their residence, workplace address, also the way in which you can contact the person, either mobile number, phone number, or their email ID, their IP address, all locational, positional information, and their economic, social, and cultural orientation. All these are very personal, very intimate information related to an individual. By looking at these data sets, if you can pinpoint who's the person behind it, then such data is personal data. Considering how intimate this data is, it's very important to safeguard this data to ensure it is not misused by any of the intermediaries involved in collecting and in processing this data. This is where the security and privacy of individual data becomes extremely important. Is that clear? So that is why data protection becomes necessary, and data protection is a triangular contest between the government, the intermediaries, and the individuals. We as individuals, as citizens, we want our data to be secure, our privacy to be kept confidential and protected. This is what we expect from the government and from the private companies, all the tech companies, the social media firms, and the other intermediaries. Government wants to uphold the right to privacy of citizens. The government has an interest to protect the right to privacy of citizens. The government also wants to uphold national security and law and order to ensure no citizen is misusing internet and other online platforms to create security challenges. This requires the private companies, intermediaries to cooperate with the government, to assist the government to share data, to share some information when it is really necessary in the interest of security and law and order. The companies have an obligation here to uphold the data privacy and security of their users, their customers. They also have an obligation to respect the law of the land, to cooperate with the security agencies and law enforcement authorities, to share data with government when necessary. At the same time, they have an obligation to protect their customers from any state surveillance. Governments might go overboard with their powers. Security and intelligence agencies, they might misuse their powers under data protection laws and force the companies to reveal sensitive personal data, which could lead to state surveillance and mass surveillance. So the intermediaries have an obligation to uphold the privacy and security of their customers and prevent states from having unauthorized excessive access to sensitive data. So this was the triangular contest that I was talking about. So a good data protection law will actually strike a balance between these conflicting interests. You can't choose one over the other. In a democratic state, all the objectives are equally important. The objectives of the individuals, the government, and the intermediaries, all three are equally important. It is important to uphold national security and law and order. It is important to protect right to privacy and data security of the citizens. It's important to protect the business environment as well for the private companies. So all the objectives are equally important. So a well-drafted data protection law has to strike this balance, this delicate, sensitive balance between conflicting objectives. With this basic conceptual understanding, let's talk about data protection in India. Let's look at the legal landscape in India. It's highly unfortunate that even though India is a IT hub, a technology hub, a hub of startups, tech-based startups, and India is also one of the biggest customer base for most social media companies and internet tech platforms. Despite this, India still does not have a data protection law in place. Please note down this point. There is no data protection law in India as of now. Is that clear? The government is in the process of bringing out a data protection law. So the history of this legal evolution can be traced back to a landmark judgment of the Supreme Court that was delivered in 2017, in which the Supreme Court declared that right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21. This was a landmark case. I want you guys to take this as an exercise. Please figure out which case was this, the name of this case, and post that in the comment section below. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court delivered a historic judgment. It widened the interpretation of Article 21 that deals with right to life and dignity and ruled that right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21. This initiated the process of treating data privacy as a fundamental right. Since India did not have a data protection law, and now that Supreme Court had clearly ruled that privacy is a fundamental right, the government started the process of putting in place a data protection regime. So to work out a data protection law, an expert committee was constituted under Justice B.N. Sri Krishna in 2017. The Justice B.N. Sri Krishna committee was tasked to provide recommendations with regard to personal data protection. Based on these recommendations, a personal data protection bill was drafted by the government in 2019, and it was even introduced in the Parliament. Is that clear? So before we talk about the status and the fate of this bill, let me explain what Justice B.N. Sri Krishna committee pointed out and what key recommendations were given by this important committee. Most of these recommendations were incorporated into the bill that was eventually drafted by the government. Justice B.N. Sri Krishna committee defined two important entities, that is data principals and data fiduciaries. Data principals are none other than the individuals who are generating the data. That is you and me, the citizens. So by recognizing them as data principals, they were being treated as the owners of data. You are generating your personal data, so you should be the owner of your data. You should have complete control over your data. That's why the term data principals. Right? The individuals are the principal elements who are generating this personal data. And the law is designed to give them control over their own data. Data fiduciaries are those intermediaries who are handling, processing, transferring and storing the user's data. This could include private firms and as well as government entities or public units. Private tech companies, social media firms, telecom and internet service providers, government agencies, they all fall under the bracket of data fiduciaries according to B.N. Sri Krishna committee recommendations. So the relationship between data principals and data fiduciaries was defined along with the obligations on data fiduciaries. Data principals were given a set of important rights, and data fiduciaries were obligated to uphold these rights, and these obligations were placed on the intermediaries. Data principals are to be given the right to consent, meaning without your consent, fiduciaries cannot collect and process your data. No company, no intermediary can collect and process your data without obtaining explicit consent from the data principal. Similarly, right to be forgotten, should also be guaranteed by the fiduciaries. Let's say tomorrow you want to end your service. Let's say you want to quit a social media platform. You want to delete your Facebook account or your Instagram account. You should have a guarantee from the company that they're not holding any data on you even after you delete your profile. Because generally the practice in the industry is that even if you delete your account, even if you end the service, even if you revoke your consent, companies retain data on you for various purposes because data is monetized. It always has a economic potential and a technological application as well. So data is still retained even after you end your service or you delete your account. So right to be forgotten should be explicitly given so that you can ensure that the intermediary erases all the data they hold on you when you're ending the service, when you're quitting the platform. So these basic rights were guaranteed to data principals, and data fiduciaries had to fulfill these obligations, these responsibilities. But however, some exemptions were granted to government entities. Because in case of certain government institutions, you can't demand the right to be forgotten or sometimes the right to consent. For example, Election Commission of India, Unique Identification Authority of India, which issues Aadhaar, the IT authorities who deal with PAN card and tax related details and information, security and law enforcement and intelligence agencies. You can't expect them to fulfill the obligations on right to consent and right to be forgotten in all the instances. So some exemptions have to be given here for government entities, and these exemptions were also recommended. Next, the committee also recommended data localization, which means the private social media firms should set up local data centers within India. See, most of the tech companies, all the big tech companies, the social media firms, they often don't store data in India. The data is stored abroad in foreign data centers. Because there are several reasons why they do that. One, they look for stable laws. They look for laws which are very progressive, which protect data privacy and data security, where governments don't practice mass surveillance in general, where there is legal constitutional protection against mass surveillance. Also, they are looking at the cost of operations because data centers are very expensive to run. You need cooling solutions, air conditioning. You need to maintain ideal temperatures. And this is very expensive in a tropical country where you have very high temperatures. They prefer cold countries, temperate regions, where the cooling solutions required are less and the cost of electricity, the cost of running the data center goes down. So due to operational considerations, legal and financial considerations, most of the companies, they store data abroad. They don't store the data locally. This creates a problem for the government of India and our government institutions, especially our law enforcement and security agencies, because they are not under our purview. They're not under our jurisdiction. Geographically, they're not within our jurisdiction. There have been many instances in the past where companies have refused to cooperate with the government and the police and law enforcement, even in genuine cases, because they had no obligation to abide by the laws here in India, as their data centers did not fall under India's legal jurisdiction. That is why the government of India is mandating data localization, meaning through law these companies will be obligated to store Indian data locally in Indian data centers. Alright, but companies are resisting this because it increases their cost of operations. Alright, so this was recommended by the committee and it was included as part of the Personal Data Protection Bill. And finally, a National Data Protection Authority was recommended to implement the law and to settle any disputes that arise. These were the key recommendations of the Sri Krishna Committee. Most of the recommendations were incorporated into the Personal Data Protection Bill that was introduced in the Parliament in 2019. But however, the government had departed from the recommendations while giving exemptions to itself. The government gave itself a lot of exemptions, especially for security agencies and law enforcement agencies. Wide sweeping exemptions were given, which would not place any of these obligations on these government entities. Justice B. N. Sri Krishna himself, the chair of the committee, was critical of what the government had done. Even though government included most of the recommendations, it departed with regard to exemptions, and the government gave itself a lot of exemptions which raised the fear of possible misuse of the law. because these powers could be misused for promoting targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. Through the law, the government can threaten and force the companies, the intermediaries, to give access to personal data and snoop on people, individuals, especially to target dissent and criticism. What if the government misuses these extraordinary powers and forces the companies to reveal data on journalists, opposition leaders, social activists and dissidents, right? This is a fundamental right. The right to criticize, the right to protest against the government is a fundamental right under Article 19. The right to free speech and expression, the right to free press. These rights can be curbed, they can be stifled if the government gives itself these extraordinary powers. That is why the law became highly controversial, the proposed law. The bill triggered a massive uproar in the parliament, and finally the government had to push the bill for a joint parliamentary committee to re-examine the bill. The joint parliamentary committee, comprising of members from Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, evaluated the provisions and suggested several amendments. Last year, the report of the joint parliamentary committee was submitted, which recommended almost 80 to 90 amendments. Since the bill had become very controversial, it had been strongly opposed within the parliament and outside of the parliament, the government finally decided to withdraw the bill itself. Instead of making so many amendments, the government decided to withdraw the bill, and now it has started work on a new personal data protection bill. All right. So in January 2023, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology has brought out a draft Digital Personal Data Protection Bill 2022. This is a new version of the bill. It's been placed in the public domain to invite feedback from the public and all the stakeholders. So the government has informed the Supreme Court that the draft bill is ready, and most likely the government will table this new bill in the upcoming monsoon session. All right. In the new bill, there are few changes the government has made. For example, it's going to replace the IT rules, the earlier IT rules of 2011 that dealt with data protection and personal data. It provides for a new categorization and new definition of data principals and data fiduciaries. Along with defining data principals and data fiduciaries, it is separating the data processor. It is separating the institutions and organizations from the individuals who are involved in processing. There is a newer definition given by the government under the law. The citizens or the users become data principals like before. They possess control over their data. They are the data generators, the citizens and the users, so they are treated as data principals. Data fiduciaries will now refer to those individuals who are handling the processing of the data, who are deciding on data processing, right? The individuals who are employees of the government agencies, the private companies, the tech companies, internet service providers, who are handling and processing sensitive private data, they are data fiduciaries. And the organizations, the institutions and the entities, they become the data processors on whose behalf the data is being processed. All right. So this has been defined under the new draft bill the government has proposed, and we might see the bill being tabled in the upcoming monsoon session. So this is what you need to understand from this important topic. All right. You can expect a variety of prelims and mains questions from here. That's why I've tried to cover this topic as comprehensively as possible. Now, let's move on to the second topic. I will take up an important editorial from page number 6 that deals with preventive detention law in India. Recently, the Supreme Court, just yesterday, the Supreme Court has observed that preventive detention law is a colonial legacy. It's a colonial hangover, and this law is often misused by the police and law enforcement agencies. And the Supreme Court has observed that it has conferred arbitrary powers on our law enforcement agencies. It has highlighted the frequent misuse of the preventive detention law in the country. Is that clear? This is basically a reiteration of the threat posed by such laws to personal liberty and our basic fundamental rights. Understood? That is the context here. The editorial appreciates the Supreme Court's observations against the preventive detention law. there are several concerns regarding the preventive detention law. So we need to understand this topic in more detail. We should know what is preventive detention. What are the legal constitutional provisions we have that recognizes preventive detention? How is it different from a regular arrest? All right, that's a key concept you need to understand. And finally, what are the problems? Why is this law misused? And what solutions are available, right? So that is what we need to discuss. As the name itself indicates, preventive detention is the detention of an individual before the crime is actually committed. The police, they have the powers under the Constitution to take an individual into custody even before they commit an actual crime, even before they disturb law and order. Based on the threat perception, all right, let's say there is a repeat offender, a repeat criminal. These are repeat offenders. Let's say there is one person who's always involved in rioting, especially during elections. This particular individual is hired by political parties. He's a goon, he's a gunda. He's hired by political parties to commit violence. He has a history of violence behind him, multiple cases against him. He has been arrested, convicted many times. So such a person poses a threat in the future as well. So if there is reason to believe that this person might pose a threat, might commit a crime, might commit an offense in the future, might pose a threat to law and order in the immediate future, then the police have the powers to take this individual into preventive detention. This is preventive detention. Detaining an individual before he or she actually commits an offense based on valid grounds. There should be a valid ground. It can't be merely on suspicion and assumptions. There should be a clear-cut valid ground to show that this individual might pose a threat in the immediate future. So based on that threat perception, the police, the law enforcement can detain a person in preventive custody. All right, this is very different from your regular arrest under your regular criminal laws. After the crime has been committed, let's say there has been a theft, a robbery, or a murder, or a kidnapping. After the crime has been committed, if the individual who has committed the crime is arrested, right, they are dealt with under the criminal laws. This is what we refer to as arrest, right? The system of arrest under the criminal laws is a punitive measure designed to punish the guilty, the accused. It is designed to hold the person responsible and accountable for the crime they have committed, to give them the punishment for the offense they have committed, and this is dealt with your ordinary criminal laws like Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code, that is CRPC. All right? So arrest happens after a crime, after the crime has been committed. The accused is arrested, and there are different safeguards for those who are arrested. The legal framework and constitutional framework is different for arrest and preventive detention. Both are very different. Preventive detention is not punitive. It is a preventive measure. It's a measure to prevent the crime from happening, prevent the individual from doing this or committing this offense, and they are detained under preventive laws, preventive detention laws. All right? So if you look at the legal constitutional framework here, both are very different. Arrest and preventive detention are different. Arrest comes after the crime. It's a punitive measure to punish the offender. Whereas preventive detention comes before the crime is actually committed. It's meant for preventive purposes. It's a preventive measure dealt with under the preventive detention laws. All right? If you have read polity, if you have understood the basic fundamental rights in the Constitution, you will know that there are few safeguards in our Constitution against arrest and preventive detention. To prevent any arbitrariness, to prevent arbitrary arrest of any individual, and to prevent arbitrary preventive detention, there is a constitutional safeguard which is enshrined under Article 22 of the Indian Constitution. Is that clear? Article 22 of the Indian Constitution deals with the safeguards regarding arrest and preventive detention. Since we are talking about preventive detention, let's specifically look at Article 22, Clause 4. It provides for procedural safeguards. The procedure the police have to follow in order to ensure that the basic rights of the detainee is not violated. There are few safeguards that are guaranteed in the Constitution. See, Article 22 is not defining arrest or preventive detention. It's not legally, constitutionally recognizing them. It's only adding safeguards, which means there is an explicit recognition that the police have the powers to detain a person in preventive custody. It also deals with arrest. Clause 1 and 2, they deal with arrest, arbitrary arrest, and 4 and 5, they deal with preventive detention. So it's only providing for the safeguards, the constitutional safeguards, to ensure that there are no arbitrary arrests and preventive detention. It's not exactly defining or enabling preventive detention and arrest. It's providing safeguards, constitutional safeguards against arbitrary arrest and detention. So this clause kicks into effect after a person has been arrested or detained. It comes after. It's a post application that you see. All right, because it's a safeguard measure. It does not tell on what grounds a person can be arrested. It does not tell on what grounds a person can be detained. It doesn't do that. It only comes in after the arrest or detention has happened, and it puts in place few safeguards to protect the fundamental constitutional rights of the arrested person or the detainee. Under clause 4 that deals with preventive detention, the time period has been clearly specified. No person can be detained for a period of more than 3 months. If they have to be detained for more than 3 months, there has to be sufficient cause. The grounds for detention has to be proven in line with the laws passed with the Parliament, and it should be certified by an advisory board comprising of judges of a high court. Is that clear? An advisory board comprising of judges of a high court or people of equal qualification, they should certify that there is justified ground here to detain this person. Even the initial detention has to be justified by the advisory board. If the detention period has to be extended beyond the 3-month period mentioned by the Constitution, then it should meet the parliamentary laws in this regard. The police have a burden here to prove to the advisory board, to the courts, that yes, this person had to be detained. There was sufficient ground, sufficient reasons to believe he's a threat, he's going to commit a crime or an offense. These grounds have to be clearly proven, and the detainee should be given basic rights and privileges. They should explain, the police should explain, they should communicate to the person on what grounds they are detaining the person. Before detaining, the grounds of detention should be clearly communicated. Alright? This should be done in writing. And they should give an opportunity for the detainee to represent themselves and seek relief in a court. This is mandatory. They should explain the reasons for detention before the detention occurs, and they should give them an opportunity where they can be heard. The detention cannot continue forever. It cannot continue for 3 months without valid justification. It can't be extended for months together, for a year together, without bail, because under preventive detention, bail is almost impossible. Right? So that is why the grounds of detention has to be justified by the police. Advisory board has to certify this. It should be in line with the other laws passed with the Parliament. Alright? So there is a duty on the state here to uphold the basic rights, the constitutional safeguards that are guaranteed with regard to preventive detention. But as you can expect, these provisions are barely followed. There is a blatant misuse of this law. Preventive detention is always, most times it is misused on a very large scale. The police are very happy to keep people under preventive detention, right? In the name of preventive detention, on very trivial grounds, people have been detained for months together, even for an entire year, right? And that too without a trial, because in preventive detention, there is no trial. You're not accused of any crime. You haven't yet committed a crime. So there is no trial. There's no legal process. The due procedure, the procedure established by law, is not being followed. So this represents a violation of rights of the detainee. Alright? In most cases, it has been seen that after a few months, the advisory board will see that there were no grounds to detain this person. Let me just give you an example. In Tamil Nadu, for example, the Gunda Act gives such wide sweeping powers that almost anyone can be classified as a Gunda in Tamil Nadu. There was one particular case, very interesting case. A street vendor, a vegetable vendor, he was charged, he was basically detained under preventive custody by being labeled as a Gunda, and you will laugh if I tell you the reason. The reason was he wasn't selling chilies of good quality. He was selling substandard quality chilies. And this became a ground for his preventive detention. He spent months together in jail without any relief. That is the extent to which the preventive detention law has been misused. States have their own acts, such as the Gunda Acts, that give wide sweeping powers to the police. They label anyone as a threat, especially as a Gunda, as a goon who might pose a threat in the immediate future. They detain them even for trivial reasons. Even after detention, the grounds for detention is not properly explained. The police don't care to explain the grounds. It's a constitutionally mandated provision. It's a safeguard. But police don't follow that. They are not given sufficient grounds, sufficient opportunities to represent themselves, raise their voice against the detention. Alright? So all the safeguards are derailed. They are not followed by the police and the law enforcement. That is why the Supreme Court has repeatedly pointed out that the preventive detention law in India is being misused. There have been many judgments, many rulings where the Supreme Court has observed that Article 22 and the preventive detention law should be read in line with Article 21. Article 21 guarantees right to life, liberty and dignity. The police cannot simply arrest anyone just because they suspect someone to be a threat to public order. There should be sufficient valid grounds which is justifiable before the board, the advisory board, and it should be justifiable in a court of law. Eventually, when these cases come to court after several months, the cases fall apart because there was never a valid ground for the detention to occur in the first place. But usually, the courts do not look into that. They don't look at the grounds for detention. They look whether the procedural safeguards, the constitutional safeguards under Article 22, were they followed or not. In most cases, they are not followed by the police. They don't explain the grounds for detention. They don't give them the right to represent themselves. So on these grounds, their detention is nullified by the court later. But the court also does not inquire whether the person had to be detained or not in the first place. Alright? This is what the editorial is arguing. This is where the Supreme Court should also pay attention. But however, the editorial appreciates what the Supreme Court has done. The Supreme Court has again reiterated how the preventive detention law is being misused, and it has clearly pointed out to the police and the government that there is an obligation on the state to follow the procedural safeguards and rigidities that are provided under Article 22. The Supreme Court has said even if there is a slight hint of doubt, it should benefit the person who has been detained, not the state. Any doubt, the benefit of doubt should be given to the person who has been detained, meaning they should be released from preventive custody if there isn't sufficient grounds for their detention. The procedural safeguards, the rigidity should be strictly followed because it's a constitutional obligation. That's what the Supreme Court has reminded to the government and the police. So the editorial says the Supreme Court has taken a right step in observing that the preventive detention laws are misused. However, Supreme Court looks more at the procedural safeguards. It does not scrutinize whether the person should have been detained or not in the first place. So editorial is suggesting that this is something Supreme Court should be doing. Go into the fact whether the person should be detained or not in the first place and take suitable action against the guilty police officers who carried out these illegal preventive detentions. And also the responsibility lies on the government and the police. You need better policing. You need better investigation to deal with crimes and law and order situation. You can't simply misuse preventive detention powers just because the Constitution enables it, right? So that is not a solution. You need better policing, efficient policing system, better investigation, so that you can tackle crime and deal with law and order situations. You can't simply misuse the preventive detention laws just because they exist. That's why the Supreme Court has said it's a colonial legacy, it's given arbitrary powers and it's being misused. Alright? So this is the point the editorial is making. Now let's move on to a very important column on page number 6, written by M.K. Narayanan. M.K. Narayanan is a distinguished expert. He is a former director of the Intelligence Bureau, India's domestic intelligence agency. He was also a former national security advisor, and later he even became the governor of the state of West Bengal under the then Manmohan Singh government. So M.K. Narayanan is a security and strategic expert. He has been a professional intelligence officer throughout his career. He comes from the IPS cadre from the Indian Police Service, and he has served as India's national security advisor. So he takes a look at attempts to revive the Khalistan movement that we have been noticing and observing in Punjab and around the world in the last few years. Actually, a few weeks back, we had a detailed discussion on this topic, right? When Amritpal Singh, the self-designated leader of this extremist group, Waris Punjab De, when it started committing arson and violence in Punjab in February, right? Immediately we had a detailed discussion on links of Waris Punjab De with Khalistan extremist outfits. Currently, Punjab police and Indian agencies are hunting for Amritpal Singh, who is on the run. He has managed to escape the police and security agencies. But this is, of course, not a new development. It's not happened overnight. Last year itself, Amritpal Singh rose to prominence on social media. He was someone who was settled in West Asia in Dubai. He came to India last year and became the self-appointed leader of Waris Punjab De, which has become a radical extremist outfit that has aligned itself with pro-Khalistan ideology and pro-Khalistan groups, right? So this group has raised fears of a possible attempt to revive the Khalistan movement, which was India's biggest security threat back in the 1980s. We are seeing similar attempts at reviving Khalistan movement abroad amongst few sections of the Sikh diaspora. In countries like Canada, US, United Kingdom, Australia, and in other European countries, even in Germany, Italy, and France, many attempts have been noticed in the last 15 to 16 years, where a clear attempt is being made to revive the dormant Khalistan movement. In 1980s, the Khalistan separatist and terrorist movement was a serious threat for India's integrity and sovereignty. But India had curbed and wiped out this movement in 1990s through strong police action and intelligence operations. India had wiped out this movement. It had become a dormant movement. But from 2010, we are seeing a deliberate attempt in Punjab and also abroad amongst few sections of the Sikh diaspora where attempts are being made to revive the Khalistan movement. So, new age extremist leaders like Amritpal Singh, they have emerged as the face of this revival attempt. There is an indication in India and around the world that such extremists and these groups have links with Khalistan terror groups like Sikhs for Justice, Babar Khalsa International, and Khalistan Liberation Force. These are designated Khalistan terror groups. India has designated them as terrorist groups under the UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Indian security and intelligence agencies have clearly brought out the links between groups like Waris Punjab De and extremists like Amritpal Singh and their connections with these extremist terror organizations. All right? So this is an ongoing attempt to revive the dormant Khalistan movement, and hence M.K. Narayanan points out that India has to draw important lessons from the past. We need to avoid the mistakes that were committed in 1970s and 1980s, and we should take timely action to curb the threat in the initial stages itself. Is that clear? Because even back in 1970s, 1980s, when the Khalistan movement was rearing its head, there were few popular extremist leaders like Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale emerged as the face of the Khalistan movement in 1980s, and he turned the sacred Golden Temple into a base for the extremist outfits. Khalistan extremists along with weapons were being accumulated in the sacred Golden Temple under the leadership of Bhindranwale. According to M.K. Narayanan, the then government under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi delayed action against Bhindranwale in the initial stages. This allowed Bhindranwale to grow his profile to become a very serious threat to India, and eventually India was forced to carry out an intervention, a military intervention that led Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to order Operation Blue Star in 1984, which was a military storming of the Golden Temple. To flush out these terrorists from the sacred Golden Temple, India carried out a military operation called Operation Blue Star, which ended up damaging the sacred shrine as well. This instigated Sikh sentiments around the world and eventually led to the assassination of the Prime Minister herself. Correct? So the writer is pointing out that there are important lessons to be drawn here. We need to act in time without wasting any time that we have available, because Amritpal Singh, he is styling himself as the next Bhindranwale. Not just figuratively, but literally. According to reports, he has undergone a cosmetic surgery as well to look like Bhindranwale. right? He has clearly stated out publicly that he idolizes Bhindranwale. He wants to be his successor, take on his legacy. So the signs are very clear, very evident, but however, still it doesn't have any mass support. Majority of the Sikh community are peaceful, they are peace-loving people. It's a beautiful religion. But however, there are few radical elements within the diaspora and in Punjab as well who are looking to exploit this divide for their own vested interests. Rather, extremism is not limited to any religion, right? And it's not the fault of any religion as well. Extremism is an outcome of political vested interests, where religious teachings are misused for their narrow political agendas. So we see something similar happening in Punjab and amongst few sections of the Sikh diaspora. Hence, the writer is urging the government and the intelligence agencies to act on time to curb the threat in the initial stages itself. Because the signs have been there since many years. When the farmers' protest took place against farm laws a couple of years ago, and when Amritpal Singh returned to India to scale up Waris Punjab Day, enough signs were available to our intelligence agencies, and ideally the Modi government should have acted immediately. The writer is warning that precious time is being lost. Most likely the same mistakes are being repeated by allowing these elements to grow before it becomes too dangerous. The timely action is very essential to curb the threat before it gets too dangerous. And of course, we cannot discount the role of Pakistan here. Pakistan's intelligence agency ISI played a critical role in sponsoring the Khalistan movement in 1980s as well. Even now, there are clear signs since 2010 that ISI is backing the revival of Khalistan movement both in India and abroad. All right? On social media, there are pro-Khalistan campaigns which have been run with clear links to Pakistan. Several Khalistan terrorists linked with Sikhs for Justice, Babar Khalsa and Khalistan Liberation Force, they are hosted and sheltered in Pakistan, and the ISI has been supporting them as well. Reportedly, some of these elements have links with Amritpal Singh. So that is why MK Narayanan is urging the Indian government to take timely action and prioritize intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis to get to the root cause. Because clearly there is discontent on the ground amongst the Sikh youth. See, every time we can't simply blame Pakistan for the entire problem. Pakistan is just an enabler. Pakistan is only enabling the divide which already exists. There is a divide on the ground. The government, the intelligence and security agencies are missing this. That is what the writer is pointing out. There is some root cause here. There is a genuine discontent on the ground. There is something that keeps the youth unhappy in Punjab and amongst the Sikh diaspora. We need to get to the root of this problem. This can be done only through painful intelligence gathering. Good old traditional intelligence gathering through human intelligence and thorough intelligence analysis and assessment to get to the root of the problem, to identify these extremists, why they are getting radicalized, why are they backing this cause. It's very crucial to get to the root of the cause in order to break the movement in the initial stages. All the time we can't simply blame Pakistan for it. Yes, Pakistan is the enabler, but without the root cause, without the divide at the ground level, Pakistan will have nothing to exploit, right? So to address the root of the problem, we have to get to the bottom, and that requires very painstaking intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis. Plus, India should create the right perception at the global level. We have to convince the world about the Khalistan threat. We faced a similar challenge in 1980s. Back then, Western countries wouldn't cooperate with India, they wouldn't help India, because according to the writer, India made mistakes in convincing the world. Canada, US, European governments, these democracies weren't helping India because India didn't pitch the Khalistan movement ideally as a serious national security threat and a global security threat. All right? Of course, there was the Cold War divide, which kept India away from Western countries, and Western countries wouldn't assist India. They were aligned with Pakistan. That angle was also there. But there was a shortcoming on India's part as well, where India failed to convince the world enough that Khalistan movement was a global security threat. Even now, the same mistakes are being done. You might have seen vandal attacks and arson attacks against Indian consulates and embassies in Australia, in United Kingdom and in the US. India has reacted violently as well. India has proactively reacted. We have criticized those governments for not protecting the Indian missions abroad. So the writer is saying, instead of reacting aggressively or proactively, it's better to work with these countries. Today we have better relations with them. We have very close strategic relations with them, including in the field of intelligence sharing and counterterrorism. So if India builds up enough evidence and convinces them of the threat, most likely these countries will cooperate, they will assist India. These groups will become a threat for those countries as well, for Canada, US and European countries. That is why the writer is urging the Modi government to focus on good old intelligence gathering, intelligence analysis, nipping the threat in the bud and tackling the Pakistani angle, not falling to the temptation of blaming Pakistan for everything, instead addressing the root cause as well, while convincing the world about the threat posed by the Khalistan movement. So these are the tasks that lie ahead for the Indian government according to M.K. Narayanan. Now let's move on to the fourth article, the fourth column from page number 8, that deals with a very important development in West Asian geopolitics. There's something dramatic happening in West Asia. It's a paradigm shift that we are witnessing. And this is a result of the strategic autonomy that Saudi Arabia is exercising in the region. Recently, Saudi Arabia has started out an independent foreign policy based on strategic autonomy. It is trying to repair its damaged relationship with regional rivals. It's trying to engage with all the global powers, trying to balance them out, and it's trying to put an end to some of the pressing conflicts in the Middle East or West Asia region. All right, so let's examine this topic in more detail. See, the moment you think of West Asia, the key powers which come to mind are Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are the two major regional rivals of West Asia. Saudi Arabia represents the Sunni power bloc, which has the backing of other Sunni powers like UAE, Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, and even Qatar to an extent. Right? All these are the Sunni powers of the region. Whereas Iran is a Shia power. It leads the Shia power bloc with the support of Syria, Lebanon, to an extent support from Iraq as well. So there is a clear sectarian divide in West Asia between the Sunni and Shia powers. There is intense rivalry between them. There is a history of geopolitical rivalry between them where they have targeted each other. They have waged covert proxy wars against each other. For example, Saudi Arabia has sponsored the destabilization of Syria. Historically, Saudi Arabia has aligned with the United States, which is the global power. Since 1970s, oil geopolitics brought US and Saudi Arabia closer. Even though Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian monarchy, the US got closer to Saudi Arabia because of its geopolitical significance and because of its control over the oil markets. So US and Saudi Arabia have been traditional allies. But however, in the initial days, that is at least until 1970s, from 1950s to 1970s, Saudi Arabia was with the other Arab countries in countering Israel as far as its support over the Palestinian issue was concerned. All the Arab states here in West Asia, even in North Africa, they were backing the Palestinian movement, giving direct support to the Palestinian movement, and even supported Egypt and Jordan and other countries here when they went to war against Israel in 1948 and in 1967. So Saudi Arabia also was hostile to Israel at one point of time, and even today, Saudi Arabia and Israel do not have official relations. But gradually, as Saudi Arabia and US got closer to each other, Saudi Arabia and Israel have made a secret peace between themselves. By 1980s, 1990s, Saudi Arabia withdrew the support for the Palestinian movement, and officially, even though it doesn't have ties with Israel, behind the scenes, Saudi Arabia is known to work with Israel. So traditionally, these three powers have been seen together. US, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they're seen to be acting together against the Shia power, Iran. That explains the regional rivalry here. So in 2011, when civil war broke out in Syria against the government of President Bashar al-Assad, it was sponsored by Saudi Arabia along with US and Israel. Israel has often targeted Syria as it has given direct support to anti-Israel outfits such as Hamas, which is a terror group operating in the Gaza Strip of Palestine. Syria is also known to support Hezbollah, another radical extremist group operating in Lebanon. These two extremist groups, Hamas and Hezbollah, they are supported by Iran as part of its covert war against Israel and American interests. All right? So Israel has often targeted Syria and Lebanon. It has, of course, targeted Hamas and Hezbollah. So this is a very complex equation that you are looking at. So traditionally, Saudi Arabia was firmly aligned with US and Israel on this regard, and it was always targeting Iranian interests. So when the destabilization of the region happened during Arab Spring of 2010-2011, a civil war was sponsored here against the Syrian government, against President Assad, as Assad was a very close ally of the Iranian regime, the Shia radical regime in Iran. So to topple the Assad government, it's known that US, Saudi Arabia and Israel sponsored the civil war, leading to the complete destabilization of Syria. This is the nature of covert wars you see here. Iran has countered this by sponsoring the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Yemen was pushed into a civil war in 2014. Yemen was a close ally of Saudi Arabia, but the Yemeni government was destabilized, thrown out, and power was captured here by Houthi rebels who are backed by Iran. This was Iran's retaliation against Saudi Arabia. You see something similar happening in the entire region, where both sides are involved in such covert proxy wars against each other. All right? So generally, there was a breakdown of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In fact, the rivalry was so serious, they had cut off their diplomatic relations back in 2016-2017. They had stopped all diplomatic engagement between themselves. All right? Saudi Arabia was seen to be backing the movement in Syria. Iran was seen to be backing the movement in Yemen. This was the situation. Saudi Arabia was always seen as an American ally, secretly working with Israel to target Iran. This had become the equation. Iran's allies here include Syria and the global powers such as Russia and China. This was the divisions that were seen in the West Asia region. All right? But now Saudi Arabia is breaking away from these divisions. This is the dramatic shift, the landmark shift that we are witnessing. Saudi Arabia has very close and very important relations with China. China has very big investments in Saudi Arabia and in West Asia, and with the help of China, Saudi Arabia has recently mediated with Iran. Recently, talks took place, you can see here in the image, and both sides have agreed to set up their diplomatic relations again. Normalcy is being restored between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is a landmark development. After almost 4 or 5 years of cutting off diplomatic relations, Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed with the mediation of China to re-establish diplomatic relations and bring normalcy back into the region. Parallelly, there are very big developments happening. Saudi Arabia and Oman, which is the neighbor of Yemen, they have sent a delegation to Yemen to hold talks with Houthi rebels. And most likely a peace agreement might be worked out very soon, which might put an end to the Houthi rebel war in Yemen. Because Houthi rebels were targeting Saudi Arabia and UAE. They were firing short-range missiles, rockets, and even drones, armed drones, to target Saudi and UAE interests. So the time has come to end these security threats, because Saudi Arabia is looking for stabilization. It wants to emerge out of all these rivalries and create a new normal in West Asia. So the restoration of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran with the mediation of China is a landmark development that highlights the declining role and influence of the US. Even though US remains a major military power here, it has a lot of troops deployed, naval fleets deployed here in West Asia. It still is a close ally of Saudi Arabia, but it still shows the declining influence of the US, the rising influence of China. China has played the mediating role because China has big economic interests, strategic interests to protect. It has used its influence with Iran and Saudi Arabia and brought them to the negotiating table. So the normalcy which has come up here is possibly leading to a peace talk with Houthi rebels. A Saudi Omani delegation has met Houthi rebels, and most likely a peace agreement might be sealed. Something similar is happening in Syria. This is another huge development. According to reports, Russia, which is a close ally of Syria, Russia is a big supporter of President Assad. As Assad has cemented his position and fought back against the rebels who were sponsored by US and Saudi Arabia, now Russia is mediating with Saudi Arabia to establish peace in Syria. Saudi Arabia might withdraw the support to the civil war in Syria, and it might recognize the legitimacy of the Assad government. There are reports that Syria might be brought back into the Arab League, which is a regional grouping of the Arab countries. And if Saudi Arabia allows Syria to rejoin the Arab League, it will represent a major normalization and it will represent a victory for the Assad government. That shows the normalcy being brought between Sunni and Shia powers with the mediation of China and Russia. So that is the crucial development here. While China played a key role in helping Saudi Arabia normalize ties with Iran, we are witnessing Russia playing a critical role in helping Saudi Arabia to normalize ties with Syria. So if this brings the Syrian civil war and the Yemeni civil war to an end, it will mark a new normalcy, a new development, a new paradigm shift in West Asian geopolitics. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is trying to protect its ties with US as well. While it gets close to Russia and China, it's balancing it out with maintaining its ties with US. Saudi Arabia still relies on US for defense and military support. It has recently ordered a $35 billion deal with Boeing, and it is looking to normalize ties with Israel, and most likely Saudi Arabia might officially recognize Israel. You guys might have heard about Abraham Accords that was signed a couple of years ago between UAE and Israel, through which UAE became the third Arab country after Egypt and Jordan to recognize Israel officially. Of course, UAE couldn't have done this without Saudi Arabia's approval. Bahrain also signed the Abraham Accords and has given recognition to Israel. So you are witnessing a major change happening. Maybe Saudi Arabia also might go ahead and officially recognize Israel and set up ties with Israel. So this way it is balancing its interests with Israel and US, and parallelly it is supporting Russia by bypassing the Western sanctions. That's very interesting. Saudi Arabia has not followed Western sanctions. It has bypassed Western sanctions, and in fact, it's helping Russia in the OPEC plus grouping to cut oil production so that the profits of Russia and the oil exporting countries can be protected. So Saudi Arabia is helping Russia in this regard to bypass the sanctions and to ensure that the profits of oil exporting countries is protected. It's also working closely with China. It has taken investments from China. It has a very big trade and defense relationship, and it has taken China's help to work out the reconciliation with Iran. So what you're witnessing is the emergence of an independent foreign policy by Saudi Arabia under King MBS or Mohammed bin Salman. So experts are pointing this out as the emergence of a new dynamic in West Asian geopolitics. You're witnessing a restructuring happening, and this is a result of the strategic autonomy that Saudi Arabia is following. It's no longer being seen as just an American ally. It's working closely with rivals as well, American rivals as well, like Russia and China, balancing out the global powers, settling its regional dispute and conflicts with Iran, Syria, trying to put an end to the regional conflicts in Yemen and Syria. All right, so all these represent very big developments. That is what you need to understand from this, because India has very, very big interests in the region. We have very close relations with Saudi Arabia and with UAE. These countries are critical. All the countries you see here in the map, they are critical for our energy supplies. Most of our oil gas imports come from here. We have signed a free trade agreement with UAE recently, and this region is home to a very strong Indian community. There are millions of Indians residing and working here. It's crucial for India to ensure their well-being and their safety. All right, so the normalization of ties can be good news for India. It could also help us revive and rebuild our ties with Iran, which has been damaged as India has followed American sanctions against Iran. All right, so this has very serious implications for Indian foreign policy towards West Asia. That is why the topic is very, very important. You just need to understand the broad dynamics that I've explained without going into the details. The details I gave was just for your understanding. But from an examination point of view, just the broad understanding is sufficient. How it relates to Indian interests is something that is more relevant. So this completes my discussion on the big articles that required a detailed analysis. Now we come to the last part of the discussion, where I'll take you through some important prelims topics. On page number 7, the Hindu carries a set of infographics related to the 17th Lok Sabha regarding the debates, the motions that have been moved in the 17th Lok Sabha, and the time taken for debates. So according to this research brought out by PRS Legislative Research, which is published by the Hindu, The 17th Lok Sabha is likely to be the shortest since 1952. There are several graphs provided here pointing out the qualitative time that has been used in the Parliament, in the Lok Sabha, regarding the budget session, and how debates have taken place, how questions have been asked, and what kind of parliamentary motions have been moved. All right? The statistics themselves are not too relevant for us. Of course, you can't mug up such stats. UPSC will not ask such factual questions as well. But this brings us to the topic of parliamentary proceedings and parliamentary motions. There are different motions mentioned in the rules of business of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. There are few conventions as well, conventional practices which are not mentioned in the rules. So these parliamentary proceedings and devices and motions are very, very important for your prelims. I have given the list in the next few slides. Here you can see question R. Under question R, the first R of every parliamentary sitting is dedicated for question R, where opposition members, MPs, can ask questions directly to the ministers concerned. There are three types of questions: start question, unstart question, and short notice question. Start question has a asterisk mark. That's why it's called a start question. This requires a oral verbal answer to be given by the concerned minister on the floor of the house, and supplementary questions cannot be asked here. For a start question, prior notice has to be given. The question has to be submitted before, so the minister can come prepared with the right arguments and evidence, and verbal answer is given by the minister on the floor of the house, but supplementary questions cannot be asked. For unstart question, written answers are given by the concerned ministry, and hence supplementary questions cannot follow in this case because it's a written answer. Whereas when verbal answers are given on the floor, the opposition can engage in a debate, it can counter the government, counter the minister, and it can ask follow-up questions. It can criticize the minister and bring up an examination of the government policies by asking these follow-up questions. But they can't do that in case of unstart questions where written answers are given. Here supplementary questions cannot follow. And a short notice question is one which is asked by giving a very short notice of less than 10 days. This is answered orally by the concerned minister. Alright, so this is how questions are asked in the question R. Then you have the motion of thanks following the President's address to the Parliament. I hope you know the President addresses the Parliament, both houses of the Parliament, after the first session of the general election, for the first session of general election. Right, after the election, after the new government has taken oath, the first session which happens is addressed by the President. And also every year, every financial year, the budget session begins with the President's address. The President's address is very critical. It brings out the priorities of the government, the policies of the government, the focus areas of the government. Following this, the motion of thanks is adopted by the House, which is put to vote, and this has to be passed in the Parliament. Because if this is defeated, it points to the defeat of the government itself. It points to the failure of the government policies and the inability of the government to get enough support in the Parliament. Alright? So motion of thanks is brought out after the President's address to the Parliament. The no confidence motion, through which the legislature can question the confidence in the executive, in the Council of Ministers. According to Article 75, Council of Ministers headed by the PM are accountable to the legislature, to the Lok Sabha. They're collectively responsible. Right? So if the Parliament, the Lok Sabha, loses confidence in the Council of Ministers, no confidence motion can be moved. It requires the support of 50 members to be admitted. It is voted upon. If it is passed, the government will fall. It means the Council of Ministers, the executive, no longer enjoys the support of the legislature, of the Lok Sabha. Then you have privilege motion, which can be moved by MPs if their parliamentary privileges are breached by a minister. If a minister has given wrong answers, deliberately distorted facts, in such cases, to censure the minister, privilege motion can be moved, which can have serious consequences for the minister. Alright? Then calling attention motion. MPs can use the motion to bring attention to an important matter of public importance. They can bring this motion, and it's a little close to the 0R. 0R is essentially an Indian innovation in parliamentary proceedings. Under 0R, which is a different type of parliamentary proceeding, MPs can raise issues of urgent public importance, but there should be a notice for raising these matters. There should be a notice given on that day before 10 a.m. Before the session gets underway, notice has to be given by the MP to the chair, to the speaker or the chairman, and immediate questions can be asked when the time is allocated by the chair. Alright, so that is 0R. Separate time is given here to bring up important questions of national importance. 0R is an Indian innovation. It does not find a mention in the rule of procedure and rule of business of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Whereas calling attention motion is slightly different. It is also an Indian innovation. It's been there from 1954. It is mentioned in our rules of parliamentary procedure, but it takes more time. There is a notice given here. The government is given time to prepare. The minister is given time to prepare and answer the question. And the MPs can use the calling attention motion to draw the attention of the government to a pressing issue, to an important issue, and extract a detailed answer from the government, a reply on these important issues. Then you have the censure motion, through which individual ministers or the entire council of ministers can be censured by the Lok Sabha. There is discussion motions, half an hour and short discussion motions, which can be pushed by MPs to carry out a debate on important issues, on critical issues. If these motions are moved, the chair of the house will allocate sufficient time, all right, for half an hour discussion. As the name itself indicates, half an hour is dedicated at least 3 days a week. Half an hour is dedicated every day to pick up these debates. There is no formal voting or motion moved after the discussion. And for short discussion, at least a couple of hours is allotted on at least 3 days a week when the session is in progress. Here as well, there is no formal motion or voting. It is just to discuss key issues, pressing issues affecting the country, where responses can be sought from the government can be criticized on the floor, counter questions can be asked. All right. So all these parliamentary proceedings, motions are very, very important for your prelims. So I've given the basic details here. Please revise this and you can expect a question from this topic. Next, on page number 10, we have a defense related article that's specifically linked with space warfare. According to the article, India's Chief of Defence Staff, the highest ranking military official, General Anil Chauhan, he has addressed the Indian DefSpace Symposium. This is the important point. The Indian DefSpace Symposium or Defence Space Symposium, it is organized by the Indian Space Association along with the DRDO. All right, please remember the basic fact. The Indian DefSpace Symposium brings together government, military, and even private stakeholders together with regard to militarization of space. The ongoing militarization of space is discussed at this symposium. The measures needed by India to protect its military assets and space assets are debated and discussed, and space technologies are considered at this symposium. So the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff, who addressed the Indian DefSpace Symposium, he has pointed out the increasing militarization of outer space and how countries are already weaponizing space and deploying weapons in outer space. Is that clear? Many countries today have weapon capabilities in outer space. Countries have developed anti-satellite capabilities. Countries like US, Russia, China, and India itself. These 4 countries, they have demonstrated kinetic anti-satellite weapons through which enemy satellites can be destroyed in orbit through a targeted interception. Just recently, a couple of years ago, India conducted a test called Mission Shakti, through which a modified ballistic missile was used to take down a defunct old Indian satellite from its orbit. It was kinetically destroyed, physically destroyed. So similarly, there are many different anti-satellite technologies that are emerging. Through electronic interception, cyber attacks, you can cripple enemy satellites. Or you can use projectiles like ballistic missiles and re-engineered spacecrafts to crash into enemy satellites through a kinetic attack and destroy the satellite in orbit. There are other passive methods. You can capture satellites in orbit by casting a net around it, or you can deflect its orbit, thus leading the satellite to fail. So there are many passive and non-passive ways of taking out enemy satellites, and these anti-satellite capabilities, these military weaponized capabilities, have been procured by these countries. There are others who are participating in this race as well. Hence, space warfare becomes a key area, a key domain of focus, because today this is the 4th dimension of warfare. Traditionally, wars were fought in three dimensions: in land, air, and water. The fourth dimension of warfare is outer space, and the fifth dimension of warfare is the cyberspace, the cyber domain. So to prepare for these emerging domains of warfare, India also has set up a dedicated military agency called the Defence Space Agency. This was a landmark defense reform introduced by India in 2019. India established a tri-service military agency called Defence Space Agency. It is headquartered in Bengaluru. Its mandate is to come out with the space warfare doctrine of India to develop offensive and defensive space weapons and assets for Indian military, to protect Indian satellite and Indian space assets. This agency has even conducted an exercise, a simulated space war exercise called Exercise in Space X. All right, it has even set up a defense space research agency to come up with space-based weapons and space-based technologies which can be employed in the military domain. So these are some developments you should be aware of. There can be a question on Indian Defence Space Symposium organized by Indian Space Association, a question on Defence Space Agency, which is a tri-service military agency. All right. Now moving on to the seventh topic from page number 12. The Indian Meteorological Department, IMD, has predicted a normal monsoon this year, and however, there are concerns about a possible El Nino condition developing in central equatorial Pacific, which might have a negative impact on the monsoon rainfall. All right. So IMD is predicting a normal monsoon on a national basis, on a national average, but certain pockets of India, central India, southern India, the prime agricultural areas are expected to receive normal or slightly above normal rainfall. But few other areas in western India and northeastern India might see a slight drop in rainfall. This is a long-term prediction by IMD. It's predicting an overall normal monsoon, but experts are worried about possible El Nino effect this season. All right. In the last few years, in the last 4 years since 2019, we were under the influence of La Nina, which is a converse phenomena happening in the central equatorial Pacific. La Nina is a positive development for India because it brings more rainfall to India. But El Nino is an adverse development. It affects the monsoons. It could bring down the rainfall in India. So let me just give you a brief idea as to what is El Nino and La Nina. See, El Nino is this climatic weather-based phenomena, geographical phenomena developing in central equatorial Pacific between Australia and South America. All right. Generally, when a normal year is present, around the Peruvian coast, you see a cold water current here, and this influences rainfall and weather patterns around the world, in Australia, in South America, and across Asia, including India, including the Indian monsoons. All right. But when an El Nino phenomena develops, you witness an unusual warming of these waters near the Peruvian coast. This abnormal warming, heating up of waters in the central equatorial Pacific has an adverse impact on Indian monsoons. It will reduce rainfall for India. El Nino is bad news for India. The converse of this is La Nina. La Nina is a phenomena where cold waters are reported. Abnormally cold temperatures are reported here along the Peruvian coast. This is good news for India. It brings more rain to India. It's beneficial for the Indian monsoon. All right. So that is the basic fact that you need to remember. La Nina has a positive impact on the monsoons. It's a abnormal cooling of the waters here in the equatorial central Pacific. El Nino is a abnormal warming of the waters in equatorial Pacific, and it has an adverse impact on Indian monsoons. All right. Now coming to the last topic from page number 14, it deals with technical textiles. The government has brought out a quality control order to ensure high quality technical textiles are produced in the country. India is one of the big producers, leading producers of technical textiles. So you should understand what are technical textiles. What applications do they have? See, technical textiles are slightly different from your regular textiles and garments. Generally, why do we produce textiles and garments? To make clothes, to make apparels. So clothes and apparels, they are meant for aesthetic purposes. They are meant to look good. They are meant to be colorful or stylish, right? So that is the aesthetic purpose which clothes and garments serve generally. But technical textiles are different. Technical textiles are manufactured, produced for their performance, for their functional properties, not for their aesthetic characteristics. Technical textiles have a huge application in 12 major industries, which are highlighted over here. These textiles, they have unique properties. They will have a lot of strength, durability. They will have a lot of properties like anti-fire properties, fire retardant properties, or cut redundant properties. So they find numerous applications because of their unique physical characteristics in agriculture, in construction, in clothing, in infrastructure creation, or in geological construction, in home-based applications, in the industry, in communication domain, in the medical domain, in athletics and sports, right? In packaging. In all these industries, technical textiles have a lot of applications. There are different types of textiles that are produced, which are used in agriculture, for example, for horticulture, for landscaping, gardening, for animal husbandry. Different textiles are used for different purposes. Then for sports, advanced gear is produced using technical textiles for athletes, which are sweat resistant, which can monitor the basic physiological parameters, including heart rate, perspiration, the salt levels, etc. So smart apparels can be produced for athletes. Even for packaging, specialized textiles can be produced. For industrial application, for construction, you can actually carry out construction. It's a construction material as well. So technical textiles find such wide applications. There are 12 broad categories where they are used, and India is one of the lead producer of technical textiles. So to ensure their quality, to improve the quality standard, a quality control order has been issued by the government to scale up the quality in the technical textile industry. All right. So just have a basic awareness as to what are technical textiles. How are they different from regular garments, and what applications do they have? So on this note, I bring my discussion to an end, and please take a look at the mains practice questions here. I hope everyone takes the question seriously. Write an answer, post the answer in the answer writing portal, for which link has been given in the description below. So this brings my discussion to an end. I hope it was productive. I hope it was helpful. Do let me know how the session went by liking the video, share your comments, and I'll see you tomorrow with the next session. Till then, take care. Have a good day.